Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. Nepal Conversation is a new podcast series where we talk to scholars and researchers about their interesting work on various aspects of Nepal. We ask them to reflect on old and new problems, challenges, and possibilities confronting contemporary Nepali society. The theme for Nepal Conversations first season is disasters. We will present a series of conversations on the topic of disasters and what it means for Nepal.
Our guest today is Dr. Liana Chase. Dr. Liana Chase is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the Durham University, UK. Liana is a medical anthropologist with a long-standing regional focus on Nepal and the Himalaya. Her work explores the implication of human diversity and inequality for mental health care. Liana's doctoral research traced the expansion of mental health services in Nepal following the 2015 Nepal earthquakes from the vantage point of a rural community in the Himalayan foothills. Today, we'll be talking to her about her research on mental health, especially in the context of crisis.
Welcome to Nepal Conversations, Liana, and thank you very much for joining us today. Uh,
Thank
you
you so much for inviting me.
you did your PhD research after the 2015 earthquake in Nepal. It was an aftermath of a natural disaster. What do you think we can learn from disasters?
Um, it's a really good question. And I should probably start by saying that I sort of wear two disciplinary hats. So I work a lot in partnership with mental health professionals, and I share an interest in kind of producing knowledge about psychic suffering, about mental suffering, and how to basically to better take care of it, to alleviate it. But my disciplinary identity is as an anthropologist. So when I answer these questions, I'm kind of coming from two different perspectives at once. Um, so I would say from my kind of mental health or psychological anthropology perspective, I think disasters offer an opportunity to learn more about how we as human beings cope with adversity. So what kinds of strategies and resources help protect us from completely falling apart when we're faced with
Mhm.
serious challenges. So my early work looked a lot at coping strategies and resilience in the Bhutanese refugee community in eastern Nepal. What's working well in this group? What are protective factors? What are strengths? What can we learn from how this group has coped with adversity? And at the same time, as an anthropologist, I think we learn a lot from considering those questions cross-culturally. So thinking about differences across cultures in the way that we experience a disaster, the way that we respond to a disaster, and ultimately the way that we recover from a trauma like a natural disaster
Mhm.
or forced displacement. Um, so basically kind of getting at this question of, how much of the way that we suffer is universal and how much is culturally specific.
Mhm.
And I think we can learn a lot about that from disasters. I would say I also bring sort of a critical social science perspective to disasters. And in that sense, I think events like the 2015 earthquakes in Nepal give us insights really into the workings of power as well. So they
Mhm.
reveal how certain segments of the population are kind of systematically rendered more vulnerable. You've probably heard coming out of social sciences, there's no such thing as a natural disaster.
Mhm.
So the effects of disaster are always profoundly socially shaped. And we see how groups like the Tamang in Nepal were disproportionately affected by the earthquake for various kind of social, political, and economic and historical reasons.
Mhm.
And you can also learn a lot, I think, from looking at the response to a disaster about how powerful institutions and actors are able to um, kind of channel the influx of funding and support that comes in after a
Mhm.
disaster towards their own ends. So there's a lot of really excellent critical anthropological work that's been done around humanitarian responses. which illustrate how even very well-meaning efforts to help and to care a lot of the times end up reproducing the same sorts of inequalities that already existed prior to the disaster, and at times even exacerbating those inequalities.
Then just to follow up on that point about there's no such thing as natural disaster, and how disaster can perpetuate pre-existing inequalities. But at the same time, what you're also saying is that disaster can, it seems from what you are saying, is disaster can also be sort of a tipping point for change, for reforms. And in your research, you mentioned about, in one of your papers that I was reading, about the progress, some of the progress that was made in the national mental health system in Nepal after the 2015 earthquake. Could you talk a little bit about, any kind of possibilities that were kind of triggered by the 2015 earthquake, and how it sort of induced any forms of reforms or lack thereof in Nepal's mental health system?
Yeah, absolutely. So I would say the earthquakes had a really profound impact on Nepal's mental health system and the small mental health sector that exists in Nepal. And a lot of the mental health professionals that I work with would say that in some ways the disaster was really helpful in drawing funding and political interest to a different type of crisis, which is, the thousands of people in Nepal with mental health problems who don't have access to evidence-based treatments. So from their perspective, disaster can serve, and this is also consistent with kind of policy coming out of the World Health Organization, disaster can serve as a platform for building back better or kind of expanding and strengthening mental health systems. Because it creates this moment when everybody is interested in mental health and willing to, and resources are available, I guess, for investment in mental health care. So for those involved in, for example, the movement for global mental health, which is something I've looked at quite a lot, the lack of services, mental health services in low-income countries like Nepal is seen as a human rights abuse. And so from their perspective, disasters can be a great boon in terms of scaling up, channeling the resources to scale up evidence-based, effective, humane treatments. But of course, that same capacity is, I think, what a lot of critical medical anthropologists are concerned about. So from a more kind of critical social science perspective, I would say we need to really be asking questions about who controls that influx of funding and support, and who decides what kinds of responses to mental suffering are appropriate. And in the mental health sector, you hear a lot of talk about evidence-based treatments. But there is a huge debate going on right now in my discipline about whether these quote unquote evidence-based mental health treatments and sort of mainstream psychiatric diagnostic categories are really useful, helpful, or appropriate outside of Europe and North America, because we know that mental disorders, the categories that we use to kind of parse mental disorders emerged in Western social contexts. They're rooted in specifically Western cultural assumptions about what kinds of behaviors and emotions are quote unquote normal and which aren't. The treatments that exist, again, have emerged in Western contexts, and they've mainly been trialed in Western educated, industrialized, democratic settings. So there's a risk that this evidence base is largely Eurocentric and doesn't necessarily speak to the potential of the treatments we have in a country like Nepal. And there's also a risk, I think, in kind of foregrounding formal mental health services as the response to disaster. There's the risk of overlooking other ways of coping and caring for mental suffering that have evolved over thousands of years in other settings, but which don't necessarily fit within kind of a medical framework. I think those kinds of support systems often get neglected or overlooked.
Thank you very much, Liana. It's really fascinating to learn about the existing systems of care that already exists in Nepal. Do you think that this might interact with the existing inequalities as well? What implications might Nepal's social context pose in the issues of mental health care?
Hmm. Yeah, it's a really good question. Actually, after the earthquake, a lot of the mental health professionals I spoke with were talking about how low rates of post-traumatic stress disorder were in Nepal. So Nepalis actually seem to fare very well compared to other groups that have experienced natural disasters like the earthquakes in terms of psychiatric morbidity or rates of mental disorder. And a lot of psychiatrists attribute this to really strong social support systems in Nepal. So to strong family, structures and community support and a sort of a sense of collectivity, or we're in this together, that seemed to emerge right after the disaster. And there was some really interesting research by Steve Folmar, who's an anthropologist. I don't think he's published it, but I've seen him present it, showing that Dalits and some ethnic minority groups actually fared better than high caste Hindus in Nepal in terms of their psychological response to the earthquake, which he felt showed that people in these marginalized communities have developed a degree of resilience to adversity and were better able to kind of cope with what they experienced in the earthquake. But I would say that in the area where I worked in Sindhu Palchik district, what was more concerning than the immediate disaster response was what happened in the following years. So after 2015, the rates of suicide in Sindhu Palchik just climbed steadily every year for at least 3 years. And a lot of people who were choosing to take their own life had suffered economically in the earthquake, and they didn't have the social capital to kind of pay off loans they had taken, for example. They weren't able to kind of navigate the system in such a way that they could rebuild their businesses and homes as quickly. And I think this is where you really start to see the toll of social inequalities on mental health. And I actually wanted to flag that there's a really interesting report that came out just in the past few months out of TU's anthropology department, which is looking at kind of community resilience capacity after the earthquakes a few years on. And they do a really nice analysis of kind of why certain disadvantaged groups had lower capacity to kind of endure the adversity that they experienced after the earthquakes, including Tamangs and other low caste Hindu groups as well.
It's really, really interesting, Liana. I also wanted to switch gear a little bit to talk about the issue of kind of working in a very disadvantaged situation in a very resource constrained setting, and mostly to do with the actually frontline mental health workers or people who are actually providing care. From obviously in a context like Nepal, I mean, what does your research? Because I know you have also focused on the experiences and the services of local mental health workers providing support. So, what kind of situation, what kind of challenges do they face, or even like other forms of their own mental health situation in dealing with this kind of crisis situation, and even generally? Could you talk a little bit about the role of like frontline mental health workers, their role, their potential or challenges they face in responding to the disaster from a mental health standpoint?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that question, because this is something I'm really passionate about, thinking about kind of the challenges that frontline mental health workers themselves face, and how that intersects with issues like low pay on the job and things like that, being generally undervalued in health systems. So I would start by saying there's kind of within this broad umbrella of mental health. There are some really different approaches to care that we see. So on the one hand, you have this kind of biomedical psychiatric approach, which, you know, in Nepal right now mainly boils down to training primary care providers to administer psychiatric drugs after very short consultations. But you also have a lot of really, in my opinion, really interesting work going on within a psychosocial framework. So a framework that really recognizes that these problems have social origins and tries to work not just with individuals, but with families. And so I spent a lot of time looking at an effort that was made to scale up psychosocial counseling services in earthquake affected districts. And basically it's very consistent with this idea of task shifting. That's kind of a hot topic in global health and especially global mental health right now. But the basic idea is that you don't need to be a medical professional to do counseling or provide therapy. Any lay person with kind of a basic high school education and some targeted training should be able to provide frontline counseling services. So I was looking at a program that trained women in earthquake affected districts to become a counselor for their own community. So to provide kind of non-judgmental listening and emotional support, allow people to ventilate their feelings. And in practice, so this particular form of counseling has been developed in Nepal and culturally adapted and kind of tweaked over the years to be more context appropriate. And in practice, it doesn't look too different from the kind of everyday kinds of care you see in families and communities, at least in my experience. But for me, I think one of the main challenges that this program faced was a lack of kind of commitment and investment on the part of the government to adequately to fund the program, really. So this program relied on young women with a high school education. It specifically targeted married women who have, you know, as you know, a huge burden of responsibility in the home. And instead of providing them a salary, they were expected to work as volunteers and they received a small financial incentive. And so they, at least the women that I spoke with, really, really struggled with basically not being treated as full professionals and paid accordingly, but at the same time being expected to do really, really difficult work, emotional labor as well. And to balance that work with kind of all their responsibilities at home when they didn't have a salary to show for it at the end of the day. So this is something I've tried to be quite outspoken about. I fully support task shifting. I think these women had an incredible capacity to do the work that they were doing, but I think they need to be remunerated in a fair way for what they're doing. I don't think we can justify scaling up services at the expense of women who are often themselves from very disadvantaged backgrounds and still kind of reeling from the effects of the earthquakes themselves.
Yeah, thank you. And it's really interesting to know about these kind of institutional responses to mental health needs as well. What are in your opinion, you know, what you saw in your research, what are the main challenges of scaling up these mental health services in a country like Nepal? And what do you think can be done to improve these?
Yeah, so that's another good question, which depends a bit kind of who you ask, even for me, it depends kind of which hat I'm wearing when I answer the question. I would say a mental health professional would answer this question very differently, probably thinking about geography, about lack of resources. They might frame Nepali culture as a barrier to scaling up, you know, this reliance on traditional healers. From my perspective as an anthropologist, the challenge to actually kind of making more good quality mental health care available is that the government seems mainly willing to invest in biomedical psychiatric models of care. So the primary investment the government made after the earthquake was training primary care providers on MHGAP, which is a WHO guideline on basically evidence-based treatment for common mental disorders. that's fairly universal. It's the same guideline is used across settings with some minor adaptations. And in my view, from what I've seen, basically what we're seeing right now is a scaling up of the worst kind of mental health care, where you have frontline primary care providers who have very little time, spending 2 or 3 minutes with somebody, deciding they have a psychiatric disorder and prescribing drugs, without really taking the time to explain to clients what the side effects of those drugs can be, why they're getting these drugs. Drug supplies are also very unstable and unreliable, which is a big problem when you have drugs, psychotropic drugs that are affecting your kind of mental functioning and emotional functioning. So I see actually the scaling up of this particular kind of checklist psychiatry model as a barrier to making more good quality care available. The government is kind of let off the hook because they've made this investment, but I think most mental health professionals would agree, it's really essential that there are complementary investments made in good quality psychosocial care, psychotherapeutic care, in improving the quality of clinician-client interactions, because we know that in the field of mental health, your relationship with the therapist is one of the kind of key ingredients when it comes to recovery. And that therapeutic relationship is just not happening in primary care settings across most of the country right now. I think there's also a need, in my opinion, for more investment in developing new models of care in the Nepal setting. So supporting locally developed approaches to dealing with mental health problems, which may or may not operate through the healthcare system. I think if you're interested in improving mental health, there are a lot of kind of community-based initiatives, spiritual care initiatives, social justice initiatives that can be just as fruitful to invest in, because all of these things have a direct impact on mental health. And for some people, they may feel more relevant and more kind of culturally appropriate.
That's really fascinating, Liana. So we've come towards the end of the conversation now, but before we start wrapping up, I wanted to ask you a slightly different question about your research, like your like collaboration and partnership with Nepali researchers or researchers who are based in Nepal, because many of your or several of your publications are kind of collaborative effort with Nepali scholars, and you co-author with them. Could you talk a little bit about your experience of working with Nepali scholars, and like, or even challenges that matter, like how did you set up those? Is it common to have that kind of collaborative thing in your discipline, coming from mental health background, or is it something that you do in your work? Or what kind of possibilities or challenges do you see in those kind of collaborative research efforts?
I think for me, collaboration has always been really important. It's kind of a core, like, ethical principle of the way that I work. And I feel really strongly also about co-authoring with the people that I collaborate with. So I started kind of a collaboration with TPO Nepal, actually when I was 21 years old and working in the Bhutanese refugee camps. So I already had that kind of pre-existing relationship with the organization, which is a national NGO. And then when the earthquake struck, I reconnected with them. So through the whole duration of my PhD work, I was a research affiliate of TPO. And I was also worked closely on projects with the Lagankel Mental Hospital and with the World Health Organization Country Office Mental Health Focal Point. So yeah, I've always worked through collaboration, and I feel quite strongly about recognizing that when it comes to authorship. I think that's quite common within the field of mental health, and much, much less common, unfortunately, in the field of anthropology, where you're really encouraged to publish single author pieces. It's just kind of a battle that I'll always be fighting within my own discipline.
Yeah, thank you very much, Liana, for your time and
Thank you so
sharing.
much. That was
Yeah.
brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank
Really
you. Thank you
appreciate it.
I really appreciate the forum. So thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, our pleasure.
Thanks a lot.